Forget everything you think you know about justice. In ancient times, a cucumber could get you arrested, and wearing the wrong color might cost you more than just a fashion faux pas. Prepare to be astounded by the truly wild and often hilarious laws that governed every aspect of life, proving that even back then, things got weird. Uncover the absurd and often hilarious ancient laws that dictated daily life, from the bizarre rules governing food consumption and surprising culinary taboos to the elaborate, sometimes violent protocols for resolving disputes and duels, revealing the surprising logic and societal values underpinning these forgotten legal systems. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History for Sleep, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. And loopholes. It was immediate, physical, and woven directly into the act of staying alive. Fear of the unknown. Every regulation, no matter how strange it seems now, was born from that pressure. From societies balanced on the edge of collapse, where one bad harvest, one uprising, or one perceived insult to the gods could unravel everything. But for stability, and stability meant predictability, which meant controlling people down to the smallest details of daily life. From what they wore, to how they mourned, from what they ate, to how loudly they spoke. And in early civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, ancient China, and later, Greece and Rome, law was less about justice and more about hierarchy made permanent, written into stone, clay, or ritual, so that no one could pretend ignorance. Because ignorance itself was often punished, and this is why the earliest legal codes, like the Code of Yunamu or Hammurabi, read less like moral guides and more like cold inventories of consequences, where a broken bone demanded another broken bone, a stolen loaf demanded a severed hand, and social rank mattered more than intent, because law did not see people as equals but as functions within a fragile machine. And belief systems tied earthly, ordered to cosmic balance, meaning that a man's hairstyle, a woman's movement outside the home, a child's legitimacy, or even the direction one slept facing could be regulated, punished, or rewarded. And this did not feel oppressive to many ancient people in the way it does to us, because for them, law was as natural as the seasons, an extension of divine will or ancestral wisdom, and resisting it was not rebellion but madness or sacrilege, something that endangered everyone. Which is why early rulers presented themselves not merely as kings but as law, incarnate pharaohs, as living gods, Mesopotamian kings as chosen by the heavens. Whether it is laughter at the wrong time, clothing that blurs class lines, or grief expressed too loudly, and the fear driving these laws was not hypothetical, because ancient cities were powder kegs, crowded, unsanitary, and politically unstable, where rumors traveled faster than armies and small disputes escalated into riots. And the result was societies where law governed not just actions, but emotions, rituals, and even thoughts, because belief itself was policed. And to modern eyes, this looks absurd, like a civilization obsessed with control for its own sake. But to ancient lawmakers, it was the difference between order and annihilation. And you see this clearly when you look at how early laws treated ambiguity. Exact penalties for specific insults, because leaving anything open to interpretation invited dispute, and dispute invited violence, and violence invited collapse. So the law became exhaustive, intrusive, and relentless, and survival meant knowing the rules, not just the big ones like murder or theft, but the small ones that governed daily conduct, because violating them could be fatal. And this created a culture of constant vigilance where people internalized the law as habit, as routine, as common sense, passing it down orally long before it was written. Where what began as tradition hardened into statute, enforced by punishment rather than consent. And over generations, no one remembered why a rule existed, only that breaking it brought consequences. And this is how laws regulating hair length, jewelry, mealtimes, burial practices, or sexual behavior persisted long after their original purpose faded, turning practical survival measures into rigid social controls. And it's important to understand that ancient lawmakers were not stupid or sadistic by default. They were operating with limited knowledge, under constant existential threat, trying to govern populations without modern infrastructure, communication, or enforcement mechanisms. So law had to be simple, visible, and terrifying enough to work without police forces or prisons as we know them. Which is why punishment was public and symbolic, meant to teach everyone watching, because deterrence was more valuable than rehabilitation, and mercy was often seen as weakness, especially in societies where rulers were judged by their ability to maintain order, not their compassion. And this harsh legal environment shaped how people thought about themselves, because identity became legal status first, and personal character second. You were a free man or a slave. Because generations lived, worked, married, and died under these systems without questioning their logic, seeing them as the natural order of things. And this sets the stage for the bizarre ancient laws that followed, because once law establishes authority over life itself, it can expand endlessly, governing not just crimes, but customs. Where the state, the gods, and the law merged into a single force that shaped every waking moment. It becomes clear that the question is not why ancient laws were bizarre, but how people endured them, adapted to them, and in many cases defended them, because to live without law, even cruel law, felt far more terrifying than living under its constant watch. And in a world where survival was never guaranteed, obedience often felt like the safest choice. In the ancient world, clothing was never just fabric stitched together for warmth or modesty. It was a legal statement, a walking declaration of who you were allowed to be. And in many societies it was regulated more strictly than speech, movement, or even food, because what you wore was instantly visible, impossible to hide, and therefore perfect for enforcing hierarchy. And to understand how bizarre ancient clothing laws were, you have to abandon the modern idea of fashion as self-expression and replace it with a harsher truth. Dress was law made visible, hierarchy turned into color, texture, and ornament, and the wrong garment on the wrong body was not a social mistake but a crime, sometimes punished with fines, public humiliation, confiscation of property, or worse, because clothing blurred boundaries that ancient societies were desperate to keep sharp, boundaries between rich and poor, citizen and foreigner, free and enslaved, male and female, sacred and profane. And when those boundaries blurred, order itself felt threatened. So lawmakers intervened with obsessive detail, dictating who could wear what, when and how, down to the number of rings on a finger or the width of a stripe on a robe. And nowhere is this clearer than in ancient Rome, where sumptuary laws turned wardrobes into legal documents, restricting luxury materials like silk, purple, dye, gold embroidery, and fine linens to specific classes, because Rome feared that visible wealth without pedigree would erode respect for the ruling elite. And purple in particular became a legal obsession, since Tyrian purple was expensive, rare, and associated with imperial authority, so tightly controlled that wearing it without permission could mark you as a traitor or a pretender. And this wasn't symbolic exaggeration, it was enforced, because clothing was propaganda, and allowing commoners to dress like senators or emperors undermined the visual language of power that kept millions obedient. And similar laws existed in Greece, where citizens were expected to dress simply to signal discipline and virtue, while excessive adornment was associated with moral weakness or foreign decadence. And in Sparta, where austerity was practically sacred, clothing laws reinforced the militarized identity of the state, discouraging individuality and luxury to ensure that no one forgot their primary role as a soldier. And even women's clothing was heavily regulated, not for modesty in the modern sense, but to signal reproductive status, family honor, and legal dependency, because a woman's appearance reflected not just herself, but the men who legally controlled her. So dress became a proxy for male authority, and stepping outside those boundaries could invite punishment, not just for the wearer but for her family. And this fixation on clothing wasn't limited to the Mediterranean world, because in ancient China, clothing laws were tied to cosmic order itself, with colors, fabrics, and styles mapped onto philosophical systems like Confucianism and the Five Elements, meaning that wearing the wrong color at the wrong time wasn't just socially inappropriate, but cosmically disruptive, a sign that heaven and earth were out of alignment. And emperors issued detailed dress codes specifying which ranks could wear silk, which colors were reserved for officials, and which patterns signified proximity to power, because visual uniformity reinforced obedience. And when rebellion occurred, one of the first things authorities looked for was clothing that broke these codes, because it signaled dissent before a single word was spoken. And in ancient Egypt, clothing laws worked differently, but were no less strict, because linen quality, cleanliness, and beliefs were unknown, and clothing became a quick way to categorize and control them. And in some cultures, enslaved people were forbidden from wearing certain garments or hairstyles, not because they couldn't afford them, but because the law needed their status to be instantly recognizable, ensuring that no one mistook a slave for a free person, because that confusion itself threatened the legal order. And even in societies that prided themselves on freedom, like Athens, clothing quietly reinforced inequality, with citizens dressing differently from men, and women expected to dress in ways that limited movement and visibility, effectively turning clothing into portable confinement. And what makes these laws feel bizarre today is how specific they were, because lawmakers didn't just ban categories of clothing, they regulated details like sleeve length, jewelry, weight, fabric transparency, and ornament placement, because each detail carried symbolic weight, and a small deviation could suggest arrogance, seduction, rebellion, or disrespect for tradition. And this obsessive regulation extended to special occasions, because festivals, funerals, weddings, and public ceremonies often had their own dress codes enforced by law, dictating colors, garments, and even hairstyles, because these events were moments when social boundaries were temporarily blurred, and the law rushed in to reassert control, ensuring that celebration didn't turn into chaos, and grief didn't turn into protest. And even mourning clothes were regulated, with limits on how long one could wear black or tear garments, because excessive grief was seen as destabilizing, drawing attention away from the living order toward individual emotion. And this fear of emotional expression shows up again and again in clothing laws, because what you wore signaled not just your status but your state of mind. and ancient societies were deeply suspicious of visible emotion, preferring restraint, uniformity, and predictability. So laws stepped in to standardize appearance as a way of standardizing behavior, and the result was a world where stepping outside dressed as oneself, rather than as the law prescribed, was an act of defiance, whether intended or not, and the punishment for that defiance could be swift, because enforcement didn't rely on police alone. It relied on social surveillance, neighbors watching neighbors, citizens reporting each other, because clothing violations were easy to spot and easy to prove, and this made everyone complicit in enforcing the hierarchy, turning society into its own warden. And it's tempting to dismiss these laws as relics of primitive thinking, but that would miss their effectiveness, because by controlling clothing, ancient states controlled aspiration, limiting how far people could imagine themselves rising, because if you couldn't dress like the elite, you were constantly reminded that you didn't belong among them, and this psychological barrier was just as powerful as any wall or chain. And in times of crisis, clothing laws often tightened rather than loosened, because scarcity made inequality more visible, and visible inequality bred resentment. So rulers restricted luxury further, hoping to reduce social tension by forcing the wealthy to appear modest, even if their power remained untouched. And this hypocrisy didn't go unnoticed, which is why clothing laws were frequently ignored, bent, or resisted in subtle ways, like hidden embroidery, forbidden colors worn indoors, or jewelry disguised as something else. Because even in rigid systems, people searched for ways to express identity and desire, and these quiet acts of resistance reveal something important. Clothing laws worked best when people believed in them, and when belief eroded, enforcement became brutal, because once people stopped accepting that fabric-defined fate, the entire visual language of power began to collapse, and rulers responded with harsher penalties, escalating fines, public shaming, and confiscations, trying to restore order through fear. And this cycle repeated across civilizations, showing that clothing laws weren't static traditions, but contested battlegrounds where power, identity, and control collided. And the bizarre detail of ancient dress codes reflects not trivial obsession, but existential anxiety. Because when you rule without modern bureaucracy, without mass communication, without standing police forces, you rule through symbols, and clothing is the most immediate symbol of all, visible before words, before actions, before intent, and by regulating it, ancient lawmakers tried to freeze society into a stable image, where everyone knew their place at a glance. And stepping outside that image wasn't just unfashionable, it was dangerous. And as we move deeper into the strange legal world of antiquity, these clothing laws serve as a reminder that freedom of expression is a very recent invention, because for most of history, what you wore wasn't a choice. It was a sentence, written in cloth, enforced by law, and read by everyone who saw you walk past. And these laws even regulated widowhood, limiting how long a widow could remain unmarried before facing legal consequences, because the state viewed reproductive potential as a public resource, not a personal one. And similar pressures existed in ancient Greece, where marriage was a civic expectation for male citizens, because producing legitimate heirs was essential to maintaining the citizen body, and women were married young, often to much older men, not because of preference, but because law and custom treated women primarily as vessels for legitimate offspring. And marriage contracts focused heavily on dowries, inheritance, and guardianship, with little attention paid to consent in the modern sense, because consent was assumed to reside with male guardians rather than with the bride herself, and this assumption was so deeply embedded that challenging it was unthinkable, because marriage was less about two individuals and more about alliances between families, neighborhoods, and political factions. And this logic extended far beyond the Mediterranean, because in ancient China, marriage was governed by Confucian principles that emphasized hierarchy, filial duty, and social harmony, and laws dictated who could marry whom, when they could marry, and under what circumstances divorce was permitted, because marriage was the foundation of family order, and family order was the foundation of state order. So a disrupted household was seen as a threat to the entire moral structure of society, and this belief justified laws that restricted remarriage, punished adultery harshly, and enforced strict roles within marriage, because stability mattered more than fairness, and even love, when it existed, was expected to conform to duty rather than challenge it. And in ancient India, marriage laws were deeply intertwined with caste, ritual purity, and religious obligation, with detailed prescriptions about acceptable matches, prohibited unions, and the duties of spouses, because marriage was a sacred contract with cosmic implications, and violating its rules was not just illegal but spiritually dangerous, threatening rebirth, karma, and social standing across generations. And this cosmic framing made marriage laws especially rigid, because flexibility risked disorder on both earthly and divine levels. And one of the most unsettling aspects of ancient marriage law is how it treated refusal, because saying no was rarely an option, and in some societies, refusing marriage could result in fines, loss of rights, or social exclusion, because unmarried adults were viewed as incomplete, suspicious, or selfish, unwilling to contribute to the continuation of the community. And this suspicion extended especially to women, whose unmarried status was often treated as a legal anomaly, requiring explanation or supervision. And even when marriage was compulsory, choice within it was limited, because laws regulated age gaps, prohibited unions across classes or professions, and enforced endogamy to preserve property and status, meaning that marriage served as a fence, keeping wealth and power contained within acceptable boundaries. And when people attempted to cross those boundaries through love or desire, law intervened to restore order, sometimes retroactively declaring marriages invalid or illegitimate, rendering children legally invisible. And this legal erasure reveals how little individual happiness mattered compared to social structure, because the law prioritized clean lines of inheritance over lived reality. And this obsession with legitimacy produced some of the strangest rules of all, because legitimacy determined everything from citizenship to burial rights. So ancient societies developed complex criteria for what constituted a valid marriage, including proper ceremonies, witnesses, contracts, and social approval, and missing even one element could invalidate the union, turning spouses into strangers in the eyes of the law, and children into legal problems rather than heirs. And this rigidity made marriage a high-risk institution, where mistakes carried lifelong consequences, and divorce, when it existed, was equally regulated, because while some societies allowed it under specific conditions, others restricted it severely, especially for women, because divorce threatened property stability and male authority. So laws often permitted men to initiate separation while trapping women in marriages, regardless of neglect or abuse, because the law viewed marital endurance as a virtue, even when it caused suffering. And this imbalance was justified through legal language that framed marriage as protection rather than confinement, arguing that women benefited from male guardianship, even when evidence suggested otherwise. And beyond individual marriages, the state also used marriage strategically to manage conquered populations, encouraging or forcing intermarriage to assimilate groups, or prohibiting it to maintain separation, depending on political needs. And these policies reveal marriage as a tool of empire, capable of dissolving identities or preserving them through law. And in some cases, marriage was used as punishment or reward, with authorities granting or denying the right to marry based on loyalty, behavior, or status, because controlling family formation was an effective way to reward obedience and discourage dissent. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect of ancient marriage law is how it treated children, because children were both the purpose and the proof of marriage, and failure to produce them could invalidate a union socially or legally, leading to pressure, replacement of spouses, or public shame. And this pressure transformed reproduction into obligation, stripping intimacy of privacy and turning the household into a site of surveillance, where neighbors, relatives, and officials monitored compliance with expectations. And this constant scrutiny reinforced conformity, because deviation invited intervention, gossip, or punishment. And what makes these laws feel especially bizarre today is not just their content, but their confidence. Ambiguity was the enemy of order. So marriage law worked to eliminate ambiguity wherever possible, even at the cost of human happiness. And while individuals found ways to resist, adapt, or circumvent these rules through informal unions, secret relationships, or social compromise, the law remained firm in its priorities, valuing predictability over compassion. And as strange as it sounds, many people accepted this arrangement because marriage offered security, status, and legitimacy in a dangerous world, and stepping outside it meant vulnerability, exclusion, and uncertainty. So compliance often felt safer than resistance. And when you step back and look at marriage by mandate as a whole, it becomes clear that ancient societies did not misunderstand love so much as distrust it, seeing personal desire as unstable, selfish, and potentially destructive. And the law stepped in to tame it, harness it, and redirect it towards social ends, turning one of the most intimate human relationships into a regulated institution, enforced by punishment and reward. And as we move forward into the next strange territory of ancient law, it's worth remembering that for most of history, marriage was not about choosing a partner, but about fulfilling a legal role. And the freedom to marry for love is not ancient tradition, but a very recent and fragile exception. In the ancient world, childhood was not a protected phase of life, defined by innocence or development, but a legally fragile condition defined by ownership, utility, and survival. And to understand how bizarre ancient laws treated children, you have to let go of the modern assumption that children automatically belonged to themselves or were inherently entitled to care. Because in many early societies, a child's legal existence depended entirely on adult recognition, usually by the father, and without that recognition, a child could be abandoned, sold, exposed, or erased from the social order without the act being considered murder or cruelty, but rather a legal decision. And this reality feels shocking today, precisely because ancient law did not center emotional bonds, but economic necessity and social stability. And children, like land or livestock, were future investments whose value had to justify their cost, especially in societies where resources were scarce and survival uncertain. So law stepped in not to protect children as individuals, but to regulate their usefulness and burden on the household and the state. And this is why some of the earliest legal codes contain chilling references to children as assets, rather than people specifying their value, their obligations, and the conditions under which they could be discarded. And nowhere is this more explicit than in ancient Rome, where the concept of patria potestas granted the father near total legal authority over his children, including the right to accept or reject a newborn, arrange marriages, control labor, and in some cases sell children into slavery to pay debts, because Roman law treated the family as a miniature state ruled by the father, and children were citizens in waiting rather than autonomous beings. And while Roman culture valued lineage and heirs, it did not automatically value individual children, especially those born with disabilities, outside marriage, or during times of hardship, because law prioritized the continuation of the family name over the welfare of every child within it. And this legal logic extended to infancy, where newborns were presented to the father for formal acceptance, and without that acceptance the child had no legal standing, no name, no inheritance, and no guaranteed right to care. And while exposure and abandonment varied in practice, the fact that the law allowed it reveals a worldview where survival trumped sentiment. And similar patterns existed in ancient Greece, where city-states like Athens granted fathers authority over children's upbringing, education, and marriage. And while Athenian law included some protections, such as limits on extreme abuse, the underlying assumption remained that children belonged to the household rather than to themselves. And Spartan law took this logic to its extreme, with the state asserting authority over children from birth, evaluating newborns for perceived strength and suitability, because Sparta viewed children not as private family members but as future soldiers whose value lay in their contribution to the collective. And while this system was justified through ideals of strength and discipline, with laws regulating adoption, inheritance, and child labor, because children were expected to work from an early age, contributing to agriculture, trade, or domestic tasks, and failure to produce value could strain the family's survival. So law allowed harsh decisions to be made under pressure, and adoption itself was often motivated less by compassion than by the need for heirs or labor, turning parenthood into a contractual arrangement rather than an emotional one. And this contractual view of childhood extended into punishment, because children could be legally punished for disobedience or failure to fulfill obligations, sometimes with severe consequences. And while modern readers may recoil at this, ancient societies saw discipline as necessary for shaping compliant adults in a dangerous world, and leniency as a luxury that risked disorder. And in ancient China, Confucian law framed children primarily through the lens of filial duty, emphasizing obedience, respect, and hierarchy. And while this system included expectations of parental care, it also reinforced the idea that children owed their existence and loyalty to their parents, particularly fathers, and disobedience was not merely misbehavior, but a legal and moral failure that could carry punishment, because harmony depended on clearly defined roles, and children were at the bottom of that hierarchy, expected to submit until adulthood and often beyond. And in ancient India, legal and religious texts similarly defined children through duty, lineage, and caste, with detailed prescriptions for upbringing, education, and obedience. And while children were valued as carriers of ritual continuity, their individual preferences or needs were secondary to family and caste obligations, and this emphasis on continuity over individuality made childhood a transitional state with limited legal agency. And one of the most unsettling aspects of ancient child law is how it treated legitimacy and social standing, and children born outside sanctioned unions were often denied recognition, regardless of their parents' affection. Because concern for future generations coexisted with legal harshness, creating a contradiction where children were simultaneously cherished and controlled, loved and commodified. where survival, obedience, and usefulness mattered more than innocence, and where the line between care and control was so thin that it often disappeared entirely. So the law stabilized the workforce by fixing expectations, and a builder, a farmer, a shepherd, or a scribe was not just performing a job, but inhabiting a legal category with defined responsibilities and punishments, and failure to meet those responsibilities could result in fines, physical punishment, or loss of status. Because the law treated labor as a contract, not just with an employer, but with society itself. And this contract was enforced through coercion rather than negotiation. And in ancient Egypt, state land, quarrying stone, or maintaining canals. And while not all laborers were enslaved, the difference between free labor and forced labor was often blurred by legal obligation, because refusal to work could be punished as a crime against order, and work itself became a civic duty rather than a private agreement. And this duty extended into taxation, because taxes were often paid in labor rather than currency, binding people to seasonal work quotas enforced by law, and failure to meet them carried penalties that could include confiscation of property or forced relocation. And this system created a population that understood work, not as a path to advancement, but as an obligation tied to birth and place. And this mindset carried into ancient China, where Confucian governance idealized agriculture as the moral backbone of society, and laws privileged farmers over merchants, because farmers produced tangible sustenance, while merchants merely moved goods. And this moral judgment was written into law, restricting merchants' rights, limiting their ability to hold office, wear certain clothing, or participate fully in civic life, because the state viewed profit-seeking as socially corrosive, and this legal bias shaped social hierarchy for centuries, demonstrating how occupation could override wealth or talent in determining status. And in Rome, occupational law became even more complex, because as the empire expanded, it needed specialized labor to maintain infrastructure, supply armies, and administer distant provinces. So the state gradually bound certain professions to the public good, especially bakers, shipbuilders, soldiers, and tax collectors. And these workers were legally prohibited from abandoning their trades, because their labor was considered essential, and desertion threatened the survival of cities. So sons inherited their fathers' occupations by law, not by preference, creating professional dynasties that could not legally dissolve. And while these workers sometimes received privileges in exchange, such as tax exemptions or legal protections, those benefits came at the cost of freedom, because opting out was not allowed. And this arrangement reveals a core truth about ancient labor law. Rights were conditional, granted not because one was human, but because one was useful, and usefulness was defined narrowly by state needs. And this conditionality extended into punishment, because legal consequences for misconduct varied dramatically by profession, with harsher penalties imposed on those whose failure endangered others, like doctors, builders, or officials, because their mistakes carried broader social risk. And in some legal systems, professionals could be punished not just for negligence, but for outcomes, regardless of intent, because the law prioritized results over fairness. and this approach created a culture of fear around responsibility, where workers operated under constant legal threat, knowing that a single failure could destroy their livelihood or worse. And yet the law also treated some professions with deep suspicion, especially those associated with knowledge, persuasion, or mobility, like scribes, lawyers, performers, and traders, because these roles challenged static hierarchy, so laws restricted their movement, taxed them heavily, or excluded them from certain rights, reinforcing the idea that social stability required people to stay in place, both physically and socially. And this fear of mobility shows up repeatedly in ancient labor laws, because moving between jobs meant moving between identities, and identity fluidity threatened order. So the law responded by fixing people where they were, sometimes literally, through residency requirements tied to occupation, making it illegal to leave one's assigned area or trade. And when people did attempt to escape, they were treated not as workers seeking opportunity, but as deserters undermining the system. And the punishment reflected that framing, often severe and public, meant to deter others. And this dynamic becomes especially grim when you consider how slavery intersected with labor law, because enslaved people occupied the bottom of the occupational hierarchy, defined entirely by labor without rights. And while slavery is often treated as a separate institution, it was deeply integrated into labor regulation, because the existence of forced labor shaped expectations for free workers, keeping wages low and mobility limited. And in some societies, the line between free labor and slavery was thin, with debt bondage legally transforming workers into property if obligations were unmet, turning economic failure into legal erasure. And this possibility hung over the working population, reinforcing compliance through fear. And even for those considered free, labor law often denied basic autonomy, regulating work hours, output, tools, and even bodily conduct, because the state claimed an interest in productivity. And this claim justified intrusion into daily routines, turning work into a site of surveillance rather than self-determination. And what makes these laws feel especially bizarre today is how openly they embraced inequality, because ancient lawmakers did not pretend that all work was equal or that all workers deserved equal treatment. Instead, they ranked occupations explicitly, assigning moral and legal value to different kinds of labor. And this ranking shaped everything from punishment, severity, to marriage eligibility, because your job influenced who you could marry, where you could live, and how you were buried, reinforcing hierarchy from birth to death. And this system produced societies where ambition was constrained not by talent but by law, because aspiring beyond one's assigned role was treated as disorder rather than progress. And yet, people still resisted, quietly and persistently, through illegal job changes, hidden trade skills, or migration, because even under rigid systems, human desire for autonomy did not disappear. And these acts of resistance reveal cracks in the legal structure, showing that occupational control was never total, but always contested. And when labor shortages became severe, states sometimes relaxed restrictions temporarily, only to tighten them again once stability returned, revealing that flexibility was possible but feared, because it threatened to expose the arbitrary nature of occupational hierarchy. And this fear explains why ancient labor laws were so detailed and so harsh, because once people realized that roles were assigned rather than destined, the legitimacy of the entire system came into question. And legitimacy was the foundation of compliance, because it offered predictability in an unpredictable world, guaranteeing food, shelter, and social belonging in exchange for freedom. And for those living on the edge of survival, that trade-off often felt reasonable, even comforting. And this acceptance does not negate the injustice of the system, but it helps explain its longevity, because ancient labor law was not imposed on a population that expected mobility, but on one that feared instability more than stagnation. And as we move forward into the next strange category of ancient law, it becomes clear that work was never just work. It was identity, obligation, and control, written into law and enforced through generations, reminding us that the modern idea of choosing a career is not a timeless human right, but a recent and fragile departure from a past where what you did defined who you were, and escaping that definition was often illegal, dangerous, or simply unimaginable. In the ancient world, speech was never free in the way we imagine it today, because words were not treated as harmless expressions of opinion, but as forces capable of shaping reality, provoking violence, angering gods, or unraveling political order. And for societies built on fragile hierarchies and shared belief, controlling speech felt as necessary as controlling weapons. Speech against the ruler was not political dissent, but sacrilege, and laws punished not only public criticism, but even careless remarks interpreted as disrespect, because words were believed to carry power. And speaking against a god-king threatened cosmic order itself, and this belief justified extreme restrictions on expression, because preserving harmony mattered more than airing grievances, and even ordinary people internalized this caution, learning to speak carefully, indirectly, or not at all when authority was near. And this culture of guarded speech shaped daily life, creating societies where silence was a survival skill. And ancient Greece presents a paradox here, because Athens is often celebrated as the birthplace of free speech, yet even their speech was tightly regulated, because while citizens could debate policy in assemblies, that right excluded women, enslaved people, foreigners, and often the poor. And even among citizens, speech had limits because laws punished slander, impiety, and speech deemed harmful to the state, and trials for impious speech show how thin the line was between philosophy and crime, because questioning the gods or mocking rituals could result in exile or death, not because ideas were inherently dangerous, but because shared belief was the glue holding the polis together. And this ambiguity made silence the safest option, because saying nothing could rarely be punished, while saying something always carried risk. And this legal climate encouraged self-censorship, where people monitored their own words constantly, anticipating how they might be perceived rather than what they meant. And this habit of internal restraint was one of the most effective tools of control, because it required no enforcement once it was internalized. And similar patterns emerged in ancient China, where Confucian ideals emphasized harmony, respect, and proper conduct, and speech that disrupted social balance was condemned, not always through harsh punishment, but through moral judgment reinforced by law, and criticizing superiors was framed as disorderly rather than courageous. So laws punished defamatory or disruptive speech, especially when it challenged authority, because harmony depended on everyone knowing their place and speaking accordingly. Words were believed to influence fate, and incorrect speech threatened not just social peace but the balance of heaven and earth. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of ancient speech law is how it extended beyond spoken words into silence itself. Because silence could be mandated, enforced, and punished if broken, and in some societies, certain names could not be spoken aloud, certain events could not be discussed, and certain topics were legally forbidden, creating zones of enforced ignorance where the law actively shaped what people knew and remembered. Ensuring that power controlled not just the present but the past, and even in everyday interactions. Speech laws shaped behavior because greetings, titles, and forms of address were regulated to reflect hierarchy, and using the wrong title or tone could be interpreted as disrespect, carrying legal or social penalties, because language encoded status, and violating linguistic norms blurred boundaries that law worked hard to maintain. And humor was especially dangerous, because jokes could undermine authority subtly. So satire was often restricted, punished, or driven underground, even though it persisted because humor is hard to suppress entirely. And what makes these laws feel bizarre today is not just their severity. And this confidence rested on a worldview where words were not neutral. And while modern societies draw sharper lines between speech and action, ancient societies often collapsed that distinction, treating harmful words as harmful deeds. And this collapse justified punishment even when no physical harm occurred, because potential harm mattered as much as actual harm. And this preventative logic explains why so many speech laws targeted intent, tone, or implication rather than concrete outcomes. And this focus made enforcement subjective. In the ancient world, speech was never free in the way we imagine it today, because words were not treated as harmless expressions of opinion, but as forces capable of shaping reality, provoking violence, angering gods, or unraveling political order. And for societies built on fragile hierarchies and shared belief, controlling speech felt as necessary as controlling weapons. So law stepped in not only to punish what was said, but to regulate who was allowed to speak, when they could speak, where they could speak, and sometimes even what they were allowed to think aloud. And this obsession with words may seem extreme now, but to ancient lawmakers, unregulated speech was one of the fastest paths to chaos, because a rumor could spark a riot, a joke could undermine authority, and a prayer spoken incorrectly could invite divine punishment. And when survival depended on stability, silence often felt safer than dialogue. So silence itself became a legal expectation. And nowhere is this clearer than in ancient Mesopotamia, where speech laws were closely tied to honor, status, and social rank. because insulting a superior was not just rude but criminal, and even speaking truthfully could be dangerous if it challenged hierarchy. So legal codes imposed fines or corporal punishment for verbal offenses, treating words as measurable harm, and the severity of punishment depended less on the content of speech than on who spoke and who was spoken to, because speech flowed downward in the hierarchy, not upward. And this principle shaped legal systems across the ancient world, where freedom of speech was not a universal right, but a privilege reserved for a narrow class. And in ancient Egypt, where the pharaoh was considered divine, speech against the ruler was not political dissent, but sacrilege. And laws punished not only public criticism, but even careless remarks interpreted as disrespect, because words were believed to carry power, and speaking against a god-king threatened cosmic order itself. And this belief justified extreme restrictions on expression, because preserving harmony mattered more than airing grievances, and even ordinary people internalized this caution. Creating societies where silence was a survival skill, and ancient Greece presents a paradox here, because Athens is often celebrated as the birthplace of free speech, yet even there, speech was tightly regulated, because while citizens could debate policy in assemblies, that right excluded women, enslaved people, foreigners, and often the poor. And even among citizens, speech had limits, because laws punished slander, impiety, and speech deemed harmful to the state, and trials for impious speech show how thin the line was between philosophy and crime, because questioning the gods or mocking rituals could result in exile or death. And when belief fractured, unity collapsed, and the law responded by policing words as a preventative measure. And in Sparta, where discipline and obedience were paramount, speech was restricted even more severely, because silence was associated with strength and restraint, and excessive talking was seen as weakness or insubordination. So social norms reinforced legal expectations, producing a culture where speaking out was rare and risky, and children were trained to speak briefly, if at all, learning early that words carried consequences. And this early conditioning reveals how deeply speech control penetrated society. Because political stability depended on managing public opinion, and while Roman elites valued rhetoric, they also feared it, because persuasive speech could mobilize crowds. So laws targeted not just seditious speech, but satire, rumor, and even excessive praise, because flattery could imply ambition, and ambition threatened imperial authority. And emperors often criminalized speech that hinted at disloyalty, even indirectly, creating an atmosphere where interpretation mattered more than intent. And this ambiguity made silence the safest option. Where people monitored their own words constantly, anticipating how they might be perceived rather than what they meant. And similar patterns emerged in ancient China, where Confucian ideals emphasized harmony, respect, and proper conduct, and speech that disrupted social balance was condemned, not always through harsh punishment, but through moral judgment reinforced by law. And criticizing superiors was framed as disorderly rather than courageous. So laws punished defamatory or disruptive speech, especially when it challenged authority. and silence as forms of communication, finding ways to speak without speaking. And these adaptations reveal the resilience of human expression, even under heavy regulation, because while law can punish words, it cannot fully extinguish thought. And this tension between control and expression runs through all ancient societies, shaping their legal systems, their cultures, and their people. And as we move deeper into the strange landscape of ancient law, it becomes clear that speech was never treated lightly. Because in a world without mass media or instant communication, words traveled through mouths, markets, and memories, carrying power far beyond their sound, and controlling them felt essential to survival, even if it meant sacrificing openness, debate, and individuality. And in that sacrifice, ancient societies built systems where silence was safety, speech was risk, and laws stood ready to punish both what was said and what was implied, reminding us that the freedom to speak openly is not a natural human condition. In the ancient world, ownership was never as simple as holding something in your hand or keeping it in your home. It was a legally defined and socially enforced concept that extended to land, livestock, tools, food, and even people, because property was power, and in societies built on scarcity, hierarchy, and survival controlling, property was essential for survival and order, and the laws that governed it were often bizarre to modern eyes, reflecting not only material concerns but moral, religious, and political priorities. And in Mesopotamia, one of the earliest known legal codes, the Code of Hammurabi, reveals how seriously ancient societies took property, prescribing specific punishments for theft, damage, or mismanagement, often including death for certain crimes. And what makes these laws striking is how precise and situational they were. Because the value of objects, the social rank of the victim, and the context of the crime all shaped the legal response. And in many cases, the law treated some stolen items as more egregious than others, not based on intrinsic value, but on symbolic or societal importance. So stealing grain, a tool, or a draft animal could trigger severe penalties, while stealing smaller personal items might be punished less harshly. And sometimes the distinction seems almost arbitrary, until you realize that each item had a role in maintaining social order. Grain fed the city, tools sustained labor, and animals ensured productivity. So theft was not merely a private loss, but a threat to collective survival, and the legal response extended even to those who failed to protect property, because negligence was interpreted as complicity, and failing to lock a door or guard livestock could bring punishment, reflecting a worldview where responsibility for the state's wealth rested on everyone, not just the thief. And property laws were even stranger when they intersected with personal relationships, because in ancient Egypt, family members could legally claim property from each other under certain conditions, and inheritance laws dictated precise divisions among children, spouses, and even extended kin, sometimes resulting in disputes codified into legal remedies centuries later. And the law treated some assets, like land or temples, as sacred, untouchable, or only transferable under specific ritualized conditions. And this blending of morality, religion, and property is repeated across ancient civilizations, because land, animals, and tools were not neutral objects, but extensions of divine order, communal stability, and human hierarchy. And even personal property like clothing or jewelry could fall under law if stolen, damaged, or misused, because personal wealth signaled status, and status was crucial to the functioning of civic or religious life. And in ancient Rome, property laws were elaborately detailed, covering everything from ownership claims to lease agreements, inheritances, and joint holdings, because Roman society relied on predictability in both wealth and legal recognition. And what might feel absurd today, like specifying the legal consequences of failing to return a borrowed ox or mismanaging a communal garden, made perfect sense in a system where community cohesion depended on precise rules, because the absence of written law invited conflict, vengeance, and social instability. And slavery complicated property laws further, because enslaved people were legally property but also subjects with certain protections under law, creating a paradoxical legal status where ownership was total. Yet the state still intervened to regulate treatment, prevent rebellion, and manage economic utility. And similar paradoxes existed elsewhere, such as in ancient China, where property ownership was tied to lineage, labor, and status. So land could be inherited, but only within strict familial or bureaucratic boundaries, and selling, gifting, or leasing land outside these bounds could be illegal, because such transactions threatened taxation, social hierarchy, and local control, and even water rights were codified into law, because controlling irrigation meant controlling survival, and failing to respect water boundaries could be considered theft or sabotage, punishable by fines, corporal punishment, or community labor. And in India, property laws were inseparable from caste, religion, and duty, because ownership signified not just wealth, but ritual and social status, and breaking property norms could disrupt cosmic as well as social order. So law treated disputes with extreme seriousness, regulating the transfer, inheritance, and use of property down to minute detail. And the strangest aspect of these ancient laws is how they treated non-human property and intangible assets, because animals, slaves, and even debts were codified into legal frameworks as objects of exchange, subject to contracts, penalties, and restitution, and failing to respect these frameworks could bring severe consequences, including death, fines, or public shaming. And sometimes the laws were so specific that they read like instruction manuals for every conceivable conflict, prescribing compensation for damage caused by oxen, carts, or fields, defining theft of particular types of grain as separate crimes, and detailing how to handle disputes over shared resources, creating a level of legal micromanagement that would overwhelm most modern legal systems. And even minor misjudgments could have disproportionate consequences, because ancient law treated property as central to survival, social hierarchy, and civic duty, so every misstep was potentially destabilizing. And in Mesopotamia, one of the most unusual features is how the law treated borrowed or lent property, because failing to return a loaned item or mismanaging it while in one's care was legally equivalent to theft, and penalties could include fines, labor, or physical punishment, reflecting a worldview in which trust and responsibility were enforceable legal obligations, because the smooth functioning of trade, agriculture, and family life depended on everyone understanding and obeying these rules. And in Rome, property law extended to the public sphere, where communal resources, streets, ports, and forums were subject to detailed legal codes. And interfering with public property could bring fines or corporal punishment, because the city needed to function as a predictable machine, and any deviation threatened order. And what makes these laws especially strange is the way they assign value to abstract and symbolic items, because legal attention was paid not only to material loss but also to honor, reputation, and social perception, meaning that slander, insult, or damage to reputation could carry property-like consequences, because social capital was considered as real as gold or land, and protecting it was as legitimate a function of law as protecting fields or livestock. And theft itself was conceptualized differently than today, because stealing an object could be interpreted as stealing status, labor, or potential productivity, and the punishment was designed not only to return the object but to restore social balance, signal deterrence, and reaffirm hierarchy, creating a legal ecosystem where property law enforced morality, hierarchy, and economy simultaneously. And in addition to regulating theft, ancient property laws also codified the limits of ownership in ways that feel almost absurd today, because laws might specify how high a fence could be, which trees could be cut, where animals could graze, and what rituals were necessary to claim new land. And property disputes were not limited to adults, because children could inherit, lose, or be transferred property under strict rules, creating situations where ownership and guardianship intersected in complex ways. Demonstrating how law treated property as both an individual and collective responsibility, and in some cases, property laws extended to intangible possessions, such as intellectual creations, prayers, rituals, and sacred knowledge, because the social value of these assets was recognized legally, and misappropriation could trigger fines, exclusion from ritual, or even capital punishment, illustrating that the concept of property in the ancient world was far broader than physical possession, encompassing influence, privilege, and spiritual authority. Because these laws blurred the line between property and personhood, showing that legal logic treated objects and people through similar frameworks of utility, responsibility, and hierarchy, and this framework persisted across cultures from Mesopotamia to Egypt, Greece, Rome, India, and China, demonstrating a universal concern with controlling both material and social assets to preserve order. And what makes these laws feel so alien today is not merely their detail, but the underlying principle that property was inseparable from law, morality, survival, and cosmic order, meaning that taking, using, or mismanaging something was never just a personal act. It was a legal, social, and sometimes spiritual offense, and ancient societies codified this reality into elaborate, bizarre, and sometimes brutal rules designed to enforce hierarchy, deter disorder, and maintain the delicate balance on which survival depended. And as we move forward into the next segment of ancient law, it becomes clear that the treatment of property reveals a worldview in which every object, from a grain of wheat to a temple, carried legal weight, and the concept of ownership was less a right than a carefully monitored responsibility, enforced with precision, fear, and extraordinary attention to detail, because in these societies, law and property were inseparable, and violating that relationship threatened not just wealth, but survival itself. In the ancient world, what you ate, when you ate it, and who could eat it, were never purely matters of personal choice or taste, because food was a critical resource, a symbol of social hierarchy, and a focus of legal, moral, and religious regulation. And to survive in societies where scarcity was constant and abundance fragile, lawmakers wrote detailed, sometimes bizarre rules about procurement, preparation, distribution, and consumption, treating food not just as sustenance but as a legal and moral instrument to maintain order. And in Mesopotamia, for example, grain was strictly regulated because controlling the harvest, storage, and distribution of staple crops was essential to prevent famine, rebellion, or economic collapse. And the law specified who could own grain, at what price it could be sold, how it could be stored, and what penalties awaited those who hoarded, adulterated, or stole it, because unchecked behavior around food could trigger crisis at a scale far beyond individual households, and laws even mandated portions in some cases, dictating how much certain classes could consume, not only as theft or negligence, but as sacrilege, because nourishment was considered both material and spiritual, sustaining the living and appeasing the divine. And this fusion of religion and law around food extended to prohibitions as well as requirements, because certain animals, parts of animals, or grains were deemed unclean or sacred, and consuming them illegally could trigger fines, corporal punishment, or exile. And in Greece, food laws reflected civic as well as religious concerns, because distributing public grain, wine, or oil required legal oversight, and failing to follow prescribed channels for consumption could constitute embezzlement or public fraud, punishable severely. And even private households were expected to observe social and ritual norms around feasts, fasting, and sacrificial offerings, because eating in the wrong way could be interpreted as disrespecting the gods, neighbors, or the city itself. And in Rome, food laws became incredibly elaborate as urban populations grew, because feeding a city of hundreds of thousands required regulation at every level, from market standards to guild oversight to port inspections, and the government controlled the price, quality, and quantity of staple items like grain and olive oil, while punishing hoarders, adulterators, and black market traders, because maintaining public access to food was considered a civic responsibility backed by law. And what makes these laws feel bizarre today is the attention paid to the minutiae of consumption, because the law could dictate not only what one could eat, but how, when, and in what quantity, with violations framed as crimes against social order, economic stability, or divine will. And in ancient India, food laws were deeply intertwined with caste, ritual purity, and social hierarchy, because eating the wrong food, in the wrong context, or with the wrong person could legally and socially transgress boundaries, and prohibitions extended beyond taboo items like meat from certain animals, to rules about cooking, serving, and sharing food, with penalties ranging from fines to ritual expiation, and sometimes social ostracism, demonstrating how eating was never merely personal but always legal, moral, and social. And famine laws were even more extreme, because scarcity demanded harsh regulation, and in times of shortage, governments imposed rationing, mandated contributions from the wealthy, and punished theft or hoarding of essential provisions, because allowing individuals to hoard or sell scarce food freely could destabilize entire regions, and in some cases, famine laws even extended to wild foods, fish, or foraged items, restricting who could gather what, where, and when, and assigning penalties for violations, because unchecked exploitation could destroy resources needed for the collective. And in China, food regulations were similarly pervasive, because rice, grain, and livestock were both economic and political resources, and imperial law tightly controlled their production, taxation, and distribution, punishing smugglers, adulterators, or unregistered traders with death, exile, or forced labor, because failure to regulate food threatened stability and legitimacy, and even cooking methods were sometimes codified, because improper preparation could spoil rations, reduce nutritional value, or violate ritual norms, and law treated these infractions as significant offenses, not trivial preferences. And the most bizarre aspects of these food laws appear when examining forbidden consumption, because what might seem like superstition or arbitrary rule often had deep social or political logic, and eating food meant for another class, stealing from public stores, consuming sacred offerings, or violating fasting requirements could all carry legal penalties, because food was power, and controlling access to it controlled behavior, loyalty, and hierarchy. And in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Rome, and China, laws could dictate even minute details, like the proper portion of bread per person, how much wine could be distributed at a feast, or who could eat meat on which days, and the enforcement of these rules ranged from fines to public shaming to corporal punishment, because the consequences of overstepping boundaries were viewed as both material and moral, threatening social order as much as physical survival. And famine laws often included community-wide obligations, because the collective survival of the city, temple, or village depended on coordinated compliance, and failure by one family could imperil many. So legal obligations extended beyond individual behavior into communal responsibility, and the consequences of violating these laws were severe, because hoarding grain, selling food at inflated prices, or eating unauthorized items could trigger legal prosecution, confiscation, or forced labor, designed to both punish and restore balance. And these rules also shaped social identity, because observing dietary laws, fasting, or sharing food correctly signaled adherence to social, religious, and civic norms, while transgression marked one as dangerous, disloyal, or impure. So food became both sustenance and legal instrument, regulating behavior from the mouth to the market, and even seemingly private acts, like eating meat, consuming certain vegetables, or drinking alcohol was subject to legal oversight, because law treated consumption as a reflection of moral and civic responsibility, and violations could result in fines, ritual expiation, or social sanctions, because the act of eating was never neutral, always entangled with hierarchy, obligation, and law. How much wine could accompany a meal, what animals could be sacrificed versus eaten, and even prohibiting sharing food with certain classes or outsiders, because every morsel carried legal weight, and failure to follow these prescriptions was not simply personal error, but a criminal offense disrupting social and cosmic order. And these intricate food regulations intersected with labor, trade, and property laws, because controlling what people could eat required controlling how it was produced, stored, and transported, and violations at any point in the chain could trigger legal consequences, because food was not just nourishment, it was state power, moral authority, and social cohesion embodied, and even in periods of abundance, laws maintained strict control, because scarcity was always a risk, and legal oversight acted as preventative measure, reinforcing hierarchy, discouraging hoarding, and ensuring equitable distribution according to social rank, ritual importance, and civic priority. And as we examine these bizarre laws today, it becomes clear that ancient societies viewed food as inseparable from law, morality, and survival, and eating was never private, never casual, and never purely pleasurable, because every bite carried legal, social, and spiritual significance, and the consequences for transgression ranged from public humiliation to death, illustrating that in these societies, the simplest human need, nourishment, was also a site of legal power, social control, and ritual order. And understanding this reveals a world where law reached into every aspect of life, regulating not only behavior and morality, but biology itself, shaping what people could consume when and under what circumstances, and punishing any deviation with a force designed to protect not just material survival, but social, political, and cosmic stability. In the ancient world, marriage and family were never merely personal or emotional arrangements, because they were deeply intertwined with law, social hierarchy, property, inheritance, and political stability, and the legal codes governing these relationships could seem utterly bizarre to modern sensibilities, treating love, consent, and choice as secondary to lineage, economic control, and social order. And in Mesopotamia, marriage was essentially a legal contract first and a personal union second, because families relied on marriage to secure alliances, property, and inheritance, and the law meticulously defined the rights, duties, and penalties for spouses, parents, and children, dictating everything from dowries and bride prices to fidelity, childbearing, and divorce. And these rules were precise, because the economic and social consequences of mismanaged marriage could ripple across families, cities, and states, and in some cases, violations triggered fines, loss of property, public shame, or even corporal punishment, because the law treated marriage as a matter of public interest, not private affection, and the consequences extended beyond the couple to their families, because marriages were often arranged to consolidate wealth, secure labor, or maintain social hierarchy, and failure to comply could destabilize entire households. And in Egypt, marriage laws incorporated religious obligations, because couples were expected to maintain harmony, not only for themselves but for the gods, with legal recognition of unions sometimes dependent on proper ritual, and children born outside approved arrangements could be denied inheritance or social recognition, because legitimacy was a legal as well as moral category, and failing to observe these rules risked both material loss and spiritual censure. And in Rome, family law was codified with astonishing detail, because the pater familias, the male head of the household, had near absolute legal authority over his children, spouse, and property, and the law reinforced this hierarchy by defining duties, privileges, and penalties within the family, so that disobedience, adultery, or failure to provide heirs could trigger legal consequences. Because dissolving a marriage affected inheritance, citizenship rights, and social order, and failure to follow the law could create disputes over property, legitimacy, and status, and these rules extended to sexual conduct because adultery, concubinage, and prostitution were all regulated with penalties varying according to social rank, gender, and citizenship. And in some societies such as Athens, adultery laws were enforced as a civic concern because maintaining legitimate heirs and social cohesion was considered a public duty, and violations were punished through fines, exile, or social sanctions, reflecting the principle that family morality was inseparable from political stability. And in India, marriage and family laws were codified into caste and religious rules, because unions were not only personal but also legal mechanisms for regulating labor, social hierarchy, and ritual purity. And marrying outside one's prescribed caste or violating kinship rules could result in social ostracism, legal penalties, or loss of property, and in some cases, even spiritual sanction, because the law equated lawful marriage with cosmic order, and unlawful marriage with disorder, threatening both family and society. And inheritance laws reinforced these boundaries, because property, titles, and obligations were transmitted through regulated lines, and failing to follow these laws could result in disputes, confiscation, or loss of rights for children and heirs. And the strangest aspects of these ancient kinship laws appear when examining their treatment of consent. And personal choice was subordinate to legal, economic, or social considerations, and in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome, and China. Not merely an emotional contract, and the law also intervened in reproduction, because ensuring legitimate heirs, controlling dowries and regulating sexual behavior were considered essential to the continuity of property, labor, and lineage, and in some cases, adultery, infertility, or failure to provide heirs was punishable under law, because the consequences threatened not just the immediate family, but the stability of inheritance systems and social hierarchies. And these rules extended to children because they were legal as well as biological heirs, and failing to raise, educate, or marry them according to legal expectations could trigger penalties for parents, guardians, or even the children themselves when they reached maturity. And this legal oversight created a society in which family life was intensely surveilled, structured, and regulated, because maintaining order at the household level was inseparable from civic, economic, and ritual stability. And in China, Confucian ideals codified filial piety into law, so children were legally required to honor, obey, and care for their parents, and failing to do so could result in fines, corporal punishment, or public censure, because disobedience was interpreted as a threat to moral and social order, and the state had a direct interest in ensuring respect for family hierarchy. These rules could redistribute wealth improperly, undermine social contracts, and triggered disputes that threatened public order. And some of the most bizarre laws regulated kinship indirectly through sexual and reproductive rules, because the state and religious authorities often dictated permissible unions, prohibited incest, regulated polygamy or concubinage, and monitored sexual behavior, because family structure was inseparable from legal, economic, and moral frameworks. And the consequences of violating these rules could include fines, corporal punishment, public shaming, exile, or spiritual penalties, demonstrating that even the most intimate human relationships were legally codified because personal conduct had direct implications for inheritance, labor, property, social order, and ritual obligation. And in Athens and Rome, the state even intervened in widowhood, remarriage, and guardianship, because widows, orphans, and unmarried women were legally vulnerable, and marriage contracts and guardianship assignments were tightly controlled to prevent disruption of family wealth and social hierarchy. And these laws created situations in which personal autonomy was severely constrained, because failing to adhere to legal expectations could jeopardize one's rights, property, or status, making obedience to law central to survival within the family unit. And in some societies, the law extended to extended kin networks, because property, labor, and social obligations were often distributed across clans or tribes, and failure to observe legal obligations to relatives could result in collective penalties, demonstrating that family law was not simply personal, but a mechanism for enforcing social cohesion, hierarchy, and accountability at multiple levels. And in certain contexts, family law intersected with religious law, because ritual obligations, temple service, and sacrificial duties were linked to family roles, inheritance, and marriage, and violating these laws could endanger spiritual as well as material welfare. And children were educated in these legal norms from a young age, learning that obedience, marriage, and reproduction were not only moral obligations but legally mandated responsibilities, and that failure to comply could bring punishment, shame, or loss of property, creating a culture where legal compliance and family duty were inseparable. And even casual social interactions, such as visiting relatives, hosting guests, or participating in festivals, were regulated to reflect legal hierarchies and social status, because the law treated family behavior as indicative of moral character and civic reliability. And when we examine these ancient kinship laws today, their strangeness is evident in how thoroughly they regulated love, sexuality, reproduction, inheritance, and interpersonal relations, leaving little room for personal preference, emotion, or autonomy, because law prioritized continuity, hierarchy, and social order over individual choice. And these laws persisted across civilizations, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, Rome, Greece, India, and China, because the household was the fundamental unit of society. And by codifying marriage, family, and inheritance, law intervened in the most intimate aspects of human life, demonstrating that personal relationships, sexual behavior, and family obligations were matters of public, legal, and moral significance, and that the ancient world understood stability, hierarchy, and survival as inseparable from the legal management of kinship, making family life simultaneously a deeply personal experience and an intensely legalized domain, where obedience, duty, and compliance were enforced across generations. Shaping not only what people did, but who they could love, how they raised children, and how families survived, thrived, or perished under the weight of legal obligation. In the ancient world, religion and law were inseparable because the survival of society was believed to depend not only on human order but on divine favor, and the laws governing ritual and religious practice could seem profoundly bizarre to modern eyes. And in Mesopotamia, religious law was meticulously codified, prescribing the proper performance of sacrifices, the timing of festivals, disease, or political instability, and priests and officials were tasked with enforcing compliance, because the law treated ritual correctness as a public obligation rather than a private devotion, and violations could result in fines, corporal punishment, or social disgrace, demonstrating that religion was not merely personal belief but a regulated, enforceable system with legal weight. And in Egypt, where gods were intimately linked to kingship, religious laws extended into every facet of public and private life, dictating temple rituals, offerings, purification rites, and even the handling of sacred objects, because failing to observe these rules could be interpreted as threatening the pharaoh's divine authority and the stability of the state, and in some cases, priests could prosecute individuals for neglecting ritual duties, enforcing compliance through penalties that ranged from fines to ostracism, emphasizing that law functioned as a guardian of both social and cosmic order. And in Greece, religious laws were intertwined with civic responsibility, because participation in festivals, sacrifices, and communal rituals was legally mandated for citizens, and failing to attend or performing rituals incorrectly could be prosecuted as impiety, threatening social cohesion and political legitimacy. And even private devotions were sometimes regulated, because certain forms of worship, sacrifices, or prayers were restricted to approved temples, officials, or sanctioned rites, and violating these rules could be punished as criminal offenses, because improper worship was believed capable of angering gods, disrupting city fortunes, or undermining authority. And in Rome, the law codified both public and private religious obligations, including festivals, sacrifices, augury, and priestly conduct, because religion was inseparable from politics, and failure to observe proper rituals could be interpreted as both personal impiety and a threat to state stability, with legal consequences enforced by magistrates or pontiffs. And some of the most bizarre religious laws focused on speech and behavior during sacred observances, prohibiting casual conversation, laughter, or even certain types of movement near temples, because law treated ritual as an act of civic responsibility, and violating these norms was a form of criminal negligence, with penalties ranging from fines to corporal punishment. And in ancient India, ritual and religious law were intertwined with caste, gender, and social hierarchy, because proper observance of Vedic rituals, temple service, and sacrificial duties was legally and socially mandated, and violating these obligations could result in fines, social ostracism, or spiritual impurity, demonstrating that law functioned to maintain both social order and cosmic balance. And food, clothing, and behavior were all regulated in ritual contexts, because pollution, contamination, or incorrect performance of rites could be treated as legal as well as spiritual offenses, and the state often enforced these laws to ensure social compliance, ritual correctness, and collective stability. And in China, Confucian and state rituals were codified into law, with precise rules governing ancestor worship, sacrifices, ceremonial music, and official duties, because the law equated ritual performance with moral rectitude and political legitimacy, and failure to observe prescribed rites could result in fines, demotion, exile, or corporal punishment, and sometimes even capital punishment, depending on the severity and social rank of the offender. And the strangest aspect of ancient ritual laws is how they regulated the smallest details of human life, from washing hands and clothing before prayer to speaking only certain words, performing gestures correctly, or handling ritual objects in approved ways because mistakes were interpreted as threats to divine favor, social order, and civic stability. And in many societies, these rules extended to festivals, marriages, funerals, and everyday interactions, because ritual was embedded in the rhythm of life, and the law treated disruption of ritual order as a criminal and civic offense. And enforcement mechanisms were often elaborate, with scribes, priests, or magistrates monitoring compliance, documenting errors, and imposing sanctions to correct behavior, demonstrating that law was both preventive and punitive, designed to maintain order through surveillance, codification, and accountability. And even seemingly private acts could be punished if they violated ritual norms, because the boundary between personal and civic responsibility was blurred. And this obsession with ritual correctness created a culture where religious observance, legal compliance, and social behavior were inseparable, and mistakes or omissions could carry consequences that were legal, social, economic, and spiritual, reflecting a worldview in which law functioned to regulate morality, hierarchy, and divine favor simultaneously. And in some cases, ancient laws mandated specific punishments for irreverence, heresy, or sacrilege, ranging from fines and restitution to corporal punishment, exile, or death, because failure to observe divine law was interpreted as destabilizing both society and cosmos. And these laws often intersected with other areas of regulation, including marriage, inheritance, property, and food, because ritual observance was inseparable from social and economic systems, and violating ritual law could trigger legal consequences in multiple domains simultaneously. And in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Rome, Greece, India, and China, law and religion were so intertwined that officials, priests, and magistrates shared responsibility for enforcing compliance, demonstrating that the boundary between spiritual duty and legal obligation was almost non-existent, and even casual violations of ritual norms could be prosecuted as criminal offenses, because the law treated ritual performance as an act of civic as well as spiritual obligation. And the consequences of non-compliance could ripple across families, communities, and cities, because one individual's error might be interpreted as a threat to divine favor and social order. Because collective responsibility was a core legal principle, ensuring that everyone participated in maintaining cosmic and social balance. And the strangest elements of these laws are often the seemingly arbitrary prohibitions, such as forbidding the handling of certain animals, touching sacred objects with bare hands, speaking forbidden words, or wearing improper clothing during ceremonies, because these rules were justified by the belief that precision in ritual preserved harmony, and that violation could trigger divine punishment, social disorder, or legal penalty. And enforcement could be strict, with scribes recording errors, priests issuing fines or ritual atonement, and magistrates administering punishment, because law and ritual were mutually reinforcing instruments of control, shaping not only belief and behavior but social hierarchy, civic obedience, and moral conduct. And these laws also reinforced gender, class, and status distinctions, because certain rituals were reserved for priests, nobles, or men, while women, slaves, and lower status individuals had restricted participation. And violating these restrictions was legally actionable, because law codified privilege as well as obligation, ensuring that hierarchy was maintained even in the spiritual domain. And as we examine these bizarre ritual laws today, the pattern is clear. Every act, every object, and every word in the religious sphere could be subject to legal oversight, because ancient societies understood that law, ritual, and morality were inseparable, and maintaining cosmic favor, social cohesion, and political authority depended on enforcing these rules with precision, surveillance, and consequences. And in this world, the distinction between crime, sin, and error was often indistinguishable, because failing to perform a ritual correctly was both legally punishable and spiritually dangerous. And law became a mechanism for managing uncertainty, fear, and the unpredictability of human and divine behavior, and the obsession with controlling ritual behavior, codifying every action, and punishing deviations, reveals a society in which law extended into the sacred, regulating behavior, thought, and even intention, because social order, divine favor, and survival were understood to be directly linked to obedience, precision, and compliance, making ritual law one of the most bizarre and all-encompassing areas of legal control in the ancient world, touching every aspect of life, reinforcing hierarchy, monitoring morality, and policing the smallest gestures in the name of cosmic and civic order. Work, but how, when, and under what conditions? And in Mesopotamia, the Code of Hammurabi prescribes laws that meticulously govern laborers, craftsmen, and servants, specifying wages, responsibilities, and penalties for failure to perform tasks, because work was not just a private affair but a matter of public interest, as the productivity of each individual had direct consequences for the survival of families, cities, and states, and fines, corporal punishment, or even death could be imposed on those who shirked duties, mismanaged resources, or failed to complete assigned labor. And in Egypt, labor laws were intertwined with state projects and religious obligations, because building temples, pyramids, canals, or granaries was both an economic and sacred endeavor, and failure to provide sufficient labor or mismanagement of workers could be interpreted as an offense against the gods and the state simultaneously. And these laws detailed not only the assignment of work, but also the hours, tools, supervision, and quality of output, because inefficiency, negligence, or sabotage could destabilize entire systems of irrigation, food supply, or public infrastructure. And in Rome, labor laws were codified across public and private spheres, because urban administration, military campaigns, and construction projects required precise allocation of manpower, and failure to comply with assigned duties could trigger legal, economic, and physical punishment, and slaves, artisans, and laborers were subject to laws regulating wages, working conditions, and supervision, because controlling labor was essential to maintain hierarchy, productivity, and social order, and even small deviations and morally accountable. And in China, imperial labor laws regulated conscription, corvée labor, guild obligations, and production quotas, because the state equated obedience in work with civic loyalty, and failure to comply could result in fines, forced labor, corporal punishment, or exile. And these regulations extended to artisans and merchants, because economic activity was inseparable from state control and legal oversight. And in some cases, entire villages could be held responsible for failing to deliver labor or produce, because collective accountability was a legal principle that reinforced social cohesion and ensured compliance. And the strangest aspects of these laws emerge when examining punishment, because consequences were often proportional not just to the act of neglect or error, but to its potential social, economic, or spiritual impact. And in Mesopotamia, a builder who caused a structure to collapse due to negligence could be executed, because the law considered the act as threatening public safety and divine order. And in Rome, a merchant selling substandard goods could be fined, enslaved, or publicly humiliated, because failure to meet labor obligations disrupted civic trust, economic stability, and social hierarchy. And in Egypt, workers failing to meet quotas on state projects could be punished with whipping, reduction in rations, or imprisonment, because labor was a civic duty essential to the functioning of the state and the appeasement of gods. And these laws extended even to the family sphere, because household labor, child rearing, and domestic service were monitored, with legal consequences for neglect or abuse, because the law treated domestic productivity as a microcosm of civic order, and failing to maintain it threatened stability at multiple levels. And labor laws were often highly stratified, because different classes, genders, and statuses were assigned different responsibilities, permissions, and penalties, and violating the boundaries of these assignments, such as a slave attempting work reserved for a free citizen, could be treated as a serious offense, punishable by fines, corporal punishment, or death, because crossing legal labor hierarchies was viewed as destabilizing, and guilds, trade associations, and labor unions, when they existed, were often legally sanctioned and required adherence to strict regulations governing apprenticeship, production, and quality control, because the law treated labor not just as a personal or economic act, but as a regulated social function, and in some civilizations, even leisure, rest, or absence from work could be legally restricted, because the state or ruling authority considered uninterrupted labor necessary for survival, infrastructure, military readiness, or religious observance, and shirking assigned work could result in penalties ranging from fines to corporal punishment, demonstrating that obedience to labor law was enforced with precision and severity, and the law often monitored work through documentation, inspections, and supervision, creating a bureaucratic system in which labor was both visible and accountable, because unrecorded, unauthorized, or poorly executed work was legally dangerous, threatening social order, economic productivity, and public safety. And in ancient India, labor laws were intertwined with caste, because occupations were legally assigned, and failure to perform one's assigned work, or attempting work outside one's caste, could result in social ostracism, fines, or ritual expiation, demonstrating that labor regulation enforced both economic and social hierarchies simultaneously, and punishments for labor violations were often highly specific, sometimes dictating the amount of restitution, the duration of forced labor, or the number of lashes for failure, because the law sought to restore balance and deter repetition. And in Greece, labor laws also extended to slaves, metics, and citizens, regulating wages, hours, and the quality of work, and even negligence or carelessness could be prosecuted as a legal offense, because work was inseparable from civic duty, social hierarchy, and economic stability. And in many cases, the law assigned collective responsibility, meaning that if one worker failed to meet obligations, the community could be punished collectively, reinforcing social cohesion and accountability. And in Rome, soldiers' labor was also regulated, because military service involved both combat and construction, and failure to perform assigned tasks could result in fines, flogging, demotion, or death, demonstrating that law treated labor as both functional and moral, because obedience reflected loyalty to the state. And in China, labor laws during conscription or corvée periods imposed detailed regulations on who could be mobilized, what tasks they could perform, and under what supervision, because unregulated labor threatened social stability, food supply, and military readiness, and failure to comply was punishable, sometimes brutally, illustrating that the law treated labor as a mechanism of control, hierarchy, and survival. And even artisans, merchants, and agricultural workers were monitored for adherence to quotas, quality standards, and prescribed techniques, because deviation from legal expectations was interpreted as a threat to social, economic, and political order. And the strangest elements of these laws emerge when considering the intersection of labor and punishment, because ancient societies often conflated inefficiency, negligence, or error with criminality, and punishments could range from fines to public humiliation, enslavement, mutilation, or death, because work was inseparable from survival, hierarchy, and civic duty, and even small infractions could ripple outward, threatening production, social trust, and state authority. And the legal obsession with labor extended into daily routine, because laws sometimes dictated how work was performed, what tools were used, how food was distributed to workers, and even how breaks and rest periods were managed, because these regulations ensured efficiency, hierarchy, and compliance, and any deviation was interpreted as both moral and legal failure. And in some societies, such as Egypt and Mesopotamia, punishment was also intended to serve as a warning to others, because law functioned as a mechanism of social control as well as corrective justice. And by making examples of labor violators, authorities enforced compliances, authorities and inforities and inforities and sporatives and spiritual and spiritual and spiritual and spiritual and squirrel and spiritual and spiritual and evil currents westquen quipirox consquisuic sequel so lux scorn cocken in scorn and quip and with on plain and we have also a bulk crusow we will work will out of whip or howif And as we examine these laws today, their strangeness lies not only in the severity of punishments, but in the obsessive regulation of work itself. Because ancient law treated labor as a public, moral, and legal obligation, inseparable from hierarchy, civic stability, survival, and cosmic order, and the pervasive monitoring of labor down to who worked, how they worked, for how long, and with what tools shows that in these societies, even the most mundane human activity was a matter of law, and every act of work carried consequences for the individual, family, community, and state, demonstrating that labor was simultaneously a legal, social, moral, and spiritual obligation, and that obedience to law in work was not optional, but essential for survival, stability, and social order, making labor a domain of both extraordinary control and bizarre legal attention, where failure, negligence, or disobedience could be punished as severely as theft, sacrilege, or rebellion. Because ancient societies understood that the proper performance of work was fundamental to maintaining hierarchy, productivity, and life itself. In the ancient world, how a person appeared in public was never merely a matter of personal preference or fashion, because dress, grooming, and decorum were tightly regulated by law, social custom, and moral expectation. And violating these rules could be considered a legal offense, with consequences ranging from fines and public shaming to corporal punishment or even exile. And in Mesopotamia, the law prescribed not only what citizens could wear, but who could wear, what colors, fabrics, and adornments, because clothing signaled social rank, economic status, and civic identity, and any attempt to appear above one's station was treated as both deceit and a challenge to social hierarchy. And in Egypt, dress codes were codified for priests, nobles, workers, and slaves, because proper attire was essential to maintain both religious order and civic hierarchy. And failing to follow these rules could be interpreted as an offense against the gods, a breach of protocol, or a threat to social stability. And even hairstyles, jewelry, and ceremonial garments were legally monitored, because appearance was inseparable from identity, authority, and ritual function. And in Rome, public dress was similarly regulated through laws like the sumptuary laws, which dictated who could wear certain types of clothing, jewelry, and colors, with penalties for overstepping boundaries, because such transgressions were viewed as both moral corruption and social disorder, and violating these regulations could provoke fines, confiscation of garments, or public humiliation, because appearance was a visual marker of law, order, and status. And the legal obsession extended beyond clothing to grooming and bodily presentation, because hair, beards, cosmetics, and even tattoos were subject to regulation, particularly for citizens of certain classes or offices, because maintaining visual markers of hierarchy and morality was considered essential to the proper functioning of society. And in ancient Greece, dress and appearance laws also reflected civic and religious priorities, because certain garments were required for festivals, public offices, or sacred ceremonies, and wearing inappropriate attire could constitute a legal offense, punishable by fines or public reprimand, because appearance in these contexts was treated as a legal as well as social obligation, signaling respect for gods, city, and community. And in China, imperial law codified precise rules governing attire, hairstyle, and adornment, because clothing was directly associated with rank, official position, and moral virtue, and violating these regulations could result in fines, demotion, or even execution, depending on the severity and the status of the offender. Because clothing and grooming were public markers of legal and moral compliance. and failure to comply could provoke punishment designed to enforce social clarity and obedience. And the strangest aspects of these laws appear in ceremonial contexts, because the law often specified precise garments, jewelry, hairstyles, and ornaments required for rituals, festivals, and public ceremonies, and even minor deviations could be interpreted as sacrilege, moral failure, or social rebellion, punishable by fines, flogging, or ritual expiation, because appearance was inseparable from civic, religious, and moral order. And in Mesopotamia, certain colors, fabrics, or adornments were legally reserved for kings, priests, or officials, and commoners attempting to wear them could be punished as impostors, because misrepresentation through appearance was considered a legal, moral, and social offense. And in Rome, the sumptuary laws extended to social gatherings, public events, and private banquets, because extravagant clothing or jewelry beyond one's rank was not only economically disruptive, but legally actionable, with penalties designed to maintain visible hierarchy and curb moral corruption. And these laws often intersected with gender norms, because men and women were legally required to dress and present themselves in ways appropriate to their sex, class, and civic role, and violations could be treated as offenses against both law and social morality. And in some societies, appearance laws also regulated behavior and deportment in public spaces, because walking, gesturing, sitting, and even posture could be codified as part of legal expectations, demonstrating that dress and appearance extended beyond clothing into the entire performance of identity, status, and obedience. And in ancient China, officials' robes, hats, and insignia were legally mandated, and wearing the wrong combination or misrepresenting one's rank could result in demotion, confiscation, or corporal punishment, because visual hierarchy was inseparable from political and social control, and failure to comply undermined both authority and order. And in India, caste-based dress regulations extended to restrictions on colors, fabrics, and ornamentation, and failure to observe these norms could trigger legal penalties and social sanctions, reinforcing the legal codification of hierarchy, purity, and status. And in Egypt, priests' ceremonial garments, headpieces, and sashes were legally prescribed, and deviation from these standards could be punished as sacrilege or criminal negligence, because appearance signaled religious authority and social legitimacy, and failing to maintain it disrupted cosmic and civic order. And the law often enforced public decorum in addition to clothing, because verbal conduct, gestures, and posture in public spaces were legally monitored, and violations could provoke fines, imprisonment, or corporal punishment, because appearance, behavior, and morality were inseparable. And the combination of dress codes, grooming rules, and behavioral expectations created a society in which personal autonomy was severely limited, because law dictated nearly every aspect of public presentation and social performance, and failure to comply was treated as a legal, moral, and civic offense, with punishments designed to restore hierarchy, maintain social order, and reinforce obedience. And even small deviations in attire or behavior could be criminalized, because visual markers were central to maintaining hierarchy, gender roles, and social cohesion. And law functioned as a mechanism for controlling both appearance and behavior simultaneously, making dress not only a personal choice, but a legally enforceable instrument of social, moral, and political regulation. And as we examine these laws today, the strangeness lies in how deeply they penetrate the human body and public presence, regulating what people could wear, how they groomed themselves, and how they presented identity and status. Because in ancient societies, every detail of appearance was legally and morally meaningful, punishable when mismanaged, and essential to the survival of civic, social, and cosmic order, demonstrating that in these worlds, clothing, grooming, and decorum were never private matters, but areas of legal authority, moral oversight, and social control, where obedience, precision, and hierarchy were enforced in every visible gesture, every garment, and every ornament. In the ancient world, speech, writing, and even thought were not purely private or personal acts, because words and ideas were understood to carry legal, social, and moral weight, and laws governing them could be both astonishingly precise and deeply bizarre, regulating everything from casual conversation to official decrees. And in Mesopotamia, the Code of Hammurabi codified punishments for false testimony, slander, and misrepresentation in speech, because lying or misleading others was not merely a personal failing but a legal offense capable of destabilizing families, trade, and civic order. And in some cases, the consequences were severe, including fines, corporal punishment, or even execution, because the law treated truthfulness and clarity of communication as essential to the functioning of society. And scribes, officials, and witnesses were legally obligated to observe these standards, with failure interpreted as a criminal act, demonstrating that speech was not simply an individual right or privilege but a regulated social instrument. And in Egypt, laws extended to writing as well as spoken words, because hieroglyphs, inscriptions, and official records were legally binding, and errors, omissions, or falsifications could be punished as forgery, negligence, or sacrilege, because texts were not merely symbols but vehicles of law, history, and divine communication. And the act of writing carried both material and moral responsibility. And in Rome, laws against libel, sedition, and false testimony demonstrate how speech was controlled to protect both political authority and social cohesion. And the law prescribed penalties for slander, insult, or the dissemination of information that could destabilize social hierarchies, because words were interpreted as acts with tangible consequences, and offenses could be punished with fines, exile, or death, depending on the status of the offender and the target. And the strangest aspects of these laws often involve prohibitions on expression that seem arbitrary today, such as restricting certain topics of conversation, censoring public criticism of officials, or forbidding unauthorized dissemination of religious texts, because authorities understood that controlling communication was necessary to maintain social order, political stability, and moral hierarchy. And in India, laws regarding speech and writing were intertwined with caste, religious duty, and morality, because words could transmit impurity, challenge authority, or violate sacred law, and offenses could be punished through fines, corporal penalties, ritual purification, or social ostracism, demonstrating that communication was legally, morally, and spiritually accountable. And in China, imperial edicts codified both what could be spoken and written, because criticism of the emperor, rebellion, or disrespect in writing or speech was considered both a legal and moral offense, punishable by fines, imprisonment, mutilation, or death, because words were understood to have power, influence, and consequence, and controlling them was essential to governance, social order, and moral hierarchy. And in Greece, the law regulated public discourse, political speech, and civic debate, because democracy required that citizens speak responsibly, and libel, false accusation, or incendiary speech could be prosecuted, sometimes resulting in fines, exile, or execution, demonstrating that law treated speech as a civic, legal, and moral instrument. And these regulations extended into private life as well, because gossip, rumor, or verbal slander were often punishable under law, reflecting the principle that private communication could have public consequences. And in Mesopotamia, certain types of curses or insults were legally actionable, because words were believed to carry power capable of harming others materially or spiritually, and punishing them was a matter of both justice and protection. And writing was equally controlled, because letters, contracts, and inscriptions were legally binding, and scribes could be held accountable for errors or misrepresentation, with penalties including fines, labor, or death in extreme cases, because the law treated the written word as both authoritative and enforceable. And the strangest examples of ancient speech and thought laws emerge in regulation of moral, religious, and philosophical expression, because words that challenged social hierarchy, questioned authority, or violated ritual norms were sometimes considered criminal, and punishment could extend to public shaming, exile, or capital punishment, because law treated speech as a tool capable of influencing obedience, belief, and order. And in Rome, verbal insult and slander were codified, and the social status of the speaker and target influenced punishment, demonstrating that words were both material and moral. or defile sacred knowledge, and the law could impose fines, corporal punishment, or ritual purification, illustrating that words were morally, legally, and spiritually accountable. And the strangest dimension of these laws appears when considering thought, because in some civilizations, suspicion of disloyalty, dissent, or impure intention could itself trigger legal investigation or punishment, because thought was understood to manifest in speech and action, and regulating words was a way of regulating intention, belief, and loyalty. And even seemingly private expression, such as gossip, poetry, or philosophical debate, could be legally constrained if authorities perceived risk to hierarchy, civic order, because law treated the mind as inseparable from speech and social behavior, and enforcement mechanisms were often elaborate, because scribes, officials, and magistrates monitored speech in public spaces, inspected written texts, and adjudicated disputes over verbal and textual misrepresentation, applying penalties ranging from fines and labor to corporal punishment or exile, and in extreme cases, death, because maintaining hierarchy, obedience, and moral conformity was considered essential to civic and spiritual survival. And these laws intersected with property, inheritance, marriage, and religious codes because words could affect contracts, legitimacy, ritual, and social trust, and violating them could trigger consequences across multiple legal domains, simultaneously demonstrating that speech writing and thought were not neutral activities but highly regulated instruments of law and social control, and even small missteps could have disproportionate consequences, because ancient societies understood that words and ideas were powerful, capable of altering reputation, property rights, social cohesion, and political stability, and that controlling them was a form of survival, hierarchy, and moral oversight. And as we examine these bizarre regulations today, it becomes clear that law in the ancient world did not separate thought, speech, or writing from morality, hierarchy, or civic duty, and every utterance, document, or expression was potentially enforceable under law, because law, social order, and cosmic balance were inseparable, and the consequences for failing to comply could ripple across private, civic, and spiritual realms, making speech and writing areas of profound legal, moral, and social control, where obedience, precision, and hierarchy were constantly monitored, enforced, and punished, demonstrating that in these societies, the act of speaking, writing, or even thinking carried weight as a legal and moral obligation, and that words themselves were treated as instruments of law, order, and survival, with every deviation potentially punishable, socially harmful, and morally dangerous, or sacrilege. And in Mesopotamia, the Code of Hammurabi meticulously regulated commerce, dictating how grain, livestock, silver, and labor could be traded, specifying prices, weights, measures, and contractual obligations, because economic stability was a matter of public survival, and unchecked behavior could lead to famine, rebellion, or social unrest, and merchants, traders, and buyers were legally accountable for misrepresentation, fraud, or failure to deliver goods, with penalties ranging from fines and restitution to corporal punishment. And in Egypt, economic laws were intertwined with religion, because temple, royal, and state monopolies controlled the flow of essential resources like grain, copper, and papyrus, and failure to comply with state-mandated trade regulations could be punished as theft or sacrilege, because violating economic law was understood as threatening both civic and cosmic order. And even common marketplaces were subject to strict oversight, because unauthorized trade, price manipulation, or hoarding could provoke legal and social consequences. And in Rome, laws governing commerce were incredibly detailed, because urban populations required consistent access to food, textiles, and imported goods, and price controls, guild regulations, and licensing laws were enforced to maintain both economic and social stability. because controlling production, distribution, and commerce was essential to imperial authority and social order, and violations could result in fines, forced labor, imprisonment, or death, because economic misbehavior was interpreted as threatening the survival and hierarchy of society. Moral and cosmic order, and the strangest aspects of these laws emerge in their obsession with detail, because legal codes often specified the quality, quantity, packaging, labeling, and permissible pricing of goods, as well as who could sell, buy, or transport them, and deviation from these rules was treated as criminal, because even minor errors could destabilize trade, disrupt social hierarchy, or violate sacred obligations. And in Mesopotamia, a trader selling underweight measures, adulterated grain, or defective goods could face severe penalties, because misrepresentation in commerce was legally equated with theft or fraud. And in Rome, guilds and licensed artisans were legally required to maintain quality standards, and failure to do so could result in fines, banishment from trade, or public punishment, because law treated the integrity of commerce as essential to civic trust and hierarchy, and economic laws also governed currency, because debasement, forgery, or unauthorized minting were treated as threats to both the economy and the authority of the state. And in Egypt, laws controlled the taxation and redistribution of grain, livestock, and craft goods, because improper economic conduct could trigger famine, inequity, or rebellion, and those responsible could face fines, forced labor, or execution, demonstrating the intertwining of survival, morality, and legality. And in Greece, trade regulations extended to foreign merchants, imports, and exports, because uncontrolled commerce could undermine local markets, civic cohesion, or political control, and violators could be expelled, fined, or subjected to corporal punishment, because law treated trade as a public, legal, and moral concern, not merely a private enterprise. And in China, guilds, markets, and caravan routes were tightly regulated, because economic misbehavior threatened taxation, supply chains, and imperial authority, and penalties for fraud, smuggling, or disobedience were severe, ranging from confiscation to forced labor or execution, reflecting the principle that economic law was inseparable from civic and cosmic order. And some of the strangest elements of these laws involve the regulation of pricing and profiteering, because authorities imposed strict ceilings, floors, and rationing on essential goods, and traders attempting to circumvent these rules could face harsh punishment, because legal control of prices was seen as essential to survival, morality, and social stability. And economic laws often intersected with labor, food, family, and religious laws, because commerce involved production, distribution, and consumption, and violations could have ripple effects across multiple domains, making enforcement complex but necessary. And in many cases, entire communities could be penalized for collective failure to comply with trade regulations, because collective responsibility was a legal principle ensuring that everyone participated in maintaining economic, social, and civic order. And these laws were enforced through inspection, documentation, and public prosecution, because law treated economic activity as visible, accountable, and morally significant. And the strangest aspects appear in prohibitions against specific commodities, forbidden trades, or exclusive rights, because legal codes dictated not only how trade was conducted, but who could participate, what could be sold, and under what conditions. And failure to observe these restrictions was legally actionable, because economic activity was inseparable from hierarchy. Moral order and civic survival and punishments were often public, harsh, and designed to reinforce obedience, because the law understood that economic behavior reflected character, loyalty, and social reliability. And as we examine these ancient economic regulations today, the strangeness is in how deeply law penetrated every transaction, regulating not only fraud and theft, but quality, quantity, pricing, participation, and even intention. Because law treated commerce as a moral and legal obligation, and every trade, contract, or transaction was accountable to civic, social, and sometimes spiritual standards, demonstrating that in the ancient world, economics was not free, Profit was not merely personal, and commerce was an area of intense legal scrutiny, moral oversight, and social control, where obedience, precision, and hierarchy were constantly enforced, and failure to comply could threaten not only the individual but families, communities, and the state, making trade, pricing, and economic behavior sites of extraordinary legal attention, societal control, and bizarre regulation that seem almost alien today. In the ancient world, crime was never merely a personal or private matter, because every violation of law, whether theft, assault, murder, or even minor misconduct, was treated as a threat to social, civic, and sometimes divine order, and the laws governing crime and punishment were often so detailed and bizarre that they could seem almost alien to modern sensibilities, because ancient legal systems codified not only the offense but the intent, status of the offender, status of the victim, and even the social consequences of the act. And in Mesopotamia, the Code of Hammurabi exemplifies this meticulous approach, specifying punishments that varied dramatically depending on whether a victim was a noble, free citizen, or slave, and whether the offender was wealthy, poor, or a servant, because justice was understood as maintaining hierarchical balance as much as punishing wrongdoing, and penalties could include fines, forced labor, mutilation, or death, depending on the perceived severity and social implications of the act. And in Egypt, criminal law was similarly intertwined with morality and divine favor, because wrongdoing was interpreted as upsetting not only human order but cosmic harmony, and offenses ranging from theft of grain to murder could trigger punishments designed to restore balance, protect property, and appease gods, with judges, priests, and magistrates enforcing compliance through fines, corporal punishment, or ritual atonement. And in Rome, criminal law was highly codified, because the Republic and later Empire required consistency in the administration of justice, and crimes such as theft, bribery, assault, or treason carried punishments ranging from fines, exile, and forced labor to crucifixion, execution, or damnatio memoria, because law treated offenses as both material and moral threats to the state, and the social hierarchy determined not only guilt but the severity of punishment, demonstrating that crime was not merely an act but a disruption of civic, social, and moral order. And in Greece, city-states regulated crime through a combination of civic courts, public trials, and punitive measures, because offenses against property, reputation, or civic duty could undermine trust and cohesion, and penalties included fines, public shaming, confiscation of goods, exile, or death. And some of the strangest criminal laws involved offenses that seem trivial today, such as insulting a magistrate, failing to maintain proper public decorum, or violating ritual protocol, because law treated even minor transgressions as potential threats to hierarchy, civic order, and divine favor. And in China, imperial criminal law codified offenses with astonishing precision, because crimes such as theft, rebellion, corruption, or disrespect toward superiors were punishable by fines, forced labor, corporal punishment, mutilation, or execution. And even minor infractions could have disproportionate consequences, because the law equated legal compliance with moral, social, and political loyalty. And in India, criminal law was similarly tied to caste, dharma, and religious morality, because offenses like theft, adultery, or fraud were treated as violations not only of law, but of moral and spiritual order, and punishments could include fines, ritual penance, social ostracism, or death, demonstrating that crime, punishment, and morality were inseparable. Or imposing the death penalty for negligence that endangered others, because law functioned as both corrective and deterrent, visible and absolute, and these punishments were publicly enforced to serve as warnings, because crime was not only a personal failure but a civic and moral danger. And in Rome, punishment was often spectacularly theatrical, including crucifixion, execution in the arena, or branding, because public display reinforced hierarchy, obedience, and social cohesion. And in Egypt, punishments could include forced labor, amputation, or ritual expiation, reflecting the intertwining of legal, social, and spiritual objectives. And criminal law often intersected with economic, labor, family, and religious laws, because offenses in one domain could ripple across multiple areas, and failure to maintain order, honesty, or duty could trigger cascading legal consequences, demonstrating the interconnectedness of ancient legal systems. And some of the most bizarre aspects appear in laws regulating intent, because thought, suspicion, or negligence could itself be treated as criminal, and individuals could be punished not only for actions but for perceived intent, inattention, or failure to prevent harm, because law was understood as a mechanism for managing both material behavior and moral responsibility. Such as punishing theft of specific animals, misrepresentation in trade, insult to officials, or failure to perform public duties correctly, because law treated even small transgressions as potential threats to hierarchy, social cohesion, and divine favor, and punishments could be correspondingly severe, ranging from forced labor, mutilation, or public humiliation to death, because law was designed to deter, correct, and restore balance. Simultaneously, and these ancient legal systems combined the practical, the moral, and the symbolic, because crime was understood as a disruption not just of property or safety, but of social, civic, and cosmic order, and justice was enacted in ways that were visible, immediate, and often shocking, to reinforce compliance, demonstrate hierarchy, and maintain trust in law. And as we examine these bizarre criminal laws today, the pattern is clear. Law in the ancient world penetrated deeply into human life, regulating not only action but intent, status, and social consequence, because crime was simultaneously a personal, civic, moral, and spiritual offense, and punishment served multiple purposes: deterrence, hierarchy enforcement, moral correction, and public display, making ancient criminal law one of the most detailed, bizarre, and all-encompassing aspects of human legal history, where obedience, precision, and compliance were enforced through extraordinary attention to hierarchy, circumstance, and social impact, and failure to comply could result in punishments that were simultaneously physical, social, economic, and spiritual, demonstrating that in these societies, crime and justice were inseparable from survival, order, and hierarchy, and that the law was not simply a tool for resolving disputes, but a mechanism for controlling society, behavior, morality, and even thought itself. As we reach the final segment of this journey through the astonishingly strict, meticulous, and often bizarre legal frameworks of the ancient world, it becomes clear that these laws, in all their strangeness, were far more than arbitrary rules. They were instruments designed to govern every aspect of human life, from labor and trade to speech appearance, ritual, and morality, because in civilizations such as Mesopotamia, Egypt, Rome, Greece, India, and China, law was inseparable from social hierarchy, divine favor, civic stability, and cosmic order, and even the smallest infractions, mispronouncing a prayer, misweighing grain, wearing the wrong color, or speaking a forbidden word, could be treated as offenses carrying fines, corporal punishment, ritual expiation, exile, or death, because law was a mechanism for managing human behavior in a world understood to be precariously balanced between order and chaos, morality and sin, stability and disaster. And these ancient laws were often bizarre, not simply because they were harsh or strange to modern eyes, but because they sought to regulate things that today we consider private, internal, or incidental, such as thought, intention, conversation, family hierarchy, clothing, grooming, or even the rhythm of daily life. Because in these societies, personal behavior was always a public matter, morally accountable, and legally enforceable. And even though we no longer enforce laws dictating dress, ritual precision, or minor verbal offenses, and the strangeness of their approach, such as punishing thought, minor negligence, or symbolic transgression, reveals how deeply law was woven into the moral and spiritual fabric of daily life. Because in these civilizations, law was not merely a tool for resolving disputes or punishing crime, but a comprehensive system that sought to align human behavior with divine and civic expectations, to reinforce social cohesion, and to prevent chaos at every level. And the meticulous documentation of fines, punishments, obligations, and prohibitions demonstrates that law functioned both as a preventive instrument and as a corrective mechanism, because every action, word, gesture, and object could potentially affect not only the individual, but the family, community, and state, and collective responsibility often amplified the stakes, making legal compliance a shared duty that extended across households, neighborhoods, and even entire regions. And as we trace the evolution of legal systems, we see echoes of these ancient practices in modern legislation, because codes regulating commerce, labor, speech, property, criminal justice, and professional behavior all descend, in part, from the notion that law must be comprehensive, enforceable, and morally grounded, and that the smallest deviation can ripple outward to affect social trust, civic stability, and collective survival. And in reflecting on these bizarre ancient laws, one realizes that their strangeness is inseparable from their purpose, because what seems arbitrary today, such as rules governing clothing, grooming, ritual correctness, or the minutiae of speech and thought, was in fact part of a coherent worldview that linked law, morality, hierarchy, economy, religion, and survival. And their legacy is a reminder that law, no matter how strange it may seem, always reflects the priorities, fears, and values of the society that enacts it. And the obsession with control, precision, and hierarchy in ancient legal systems illustrates the human desire to create order from chaos, to protect society from internal and external threats, and to enforce a moral and civic vision that blends the practical with the spiritual, the visible with the symbolic, and the individual with the collective. And as we compare these ancient laws to our modern legal frameworks, we see that while the methods have changed and the punishments may be less extreme, the underlying goals regulating behavior, maintaining social cohesion, protecting hierarchy, and ensuring accountability remain remarkably consistent, demonstrating that the human impulse to codify, monitor, and enforce rules is timeless, and that even the most bizarre and draconian laws of antiquity contributed to the evolution of legal thought, illustrating the enduring connection between law, morality, society, and survival. And as we close this exploration of ancient legal strangeness, it is worth noting that these laws, in their obsession with detail, their intertwining of morality and legality, and their regulation of nearly every aspect of life, reveal a worldview in which obedience, hierarchy, and compliance were not optional but essential, and where the act of living itself, speaking, working, dressing, worshipping, trading, or even thinking, was a legally significant act, subject to scrutiny, accountability, and consequence. And the enduring lesson of these bizarre ancient laws is that law is always more than a set of rules. It is a reflection of human priorities, fears, values, and the eternal attempt to order the chaos of life, society, and the cosmos. And in studying them, we not only marvel at their strangeness, but gain insight into the extraordinary lengths to which humans have gone to enforce order, morality, and survival, and understand that even the most alien-seeming legal codes of the past laid the groundwork for the complex, structured, and morally infused legal systems we navigate today, leaving a legacy that is simultaneously strange, instructive, and profoundly human. And so, dear traveler, as we close the dusty scrolls of time and step away from the courts, streets, and marketplaces of long-forgotten civilizations, we carry with us the echoes of laws so meticulous, bizarre, and all-encompassing that they governed not just actions but thoughts, words, appearances, trades, and even the rhythm of daily life. And while many of these ancient rules may seem cruel, excessive, or almost comically strange to modern eyes, they reveal a world where survival, hierarchy, morality, and cosmic order were inseparable, and where obedience to law was a daily, living responsibility, a dance with both the divine and the civic, a reminder that the past was a place of vigilance, discipline, and extraordinary human imagination. And as you lay your head down tonight, let the stories of these ancient laws drift through your mind like the flickering torchlight in a forgotten palace, whispering the strange priorities, fears, and orderings of civilizations that shaped humanity's journey. And may the peculiar wisdom of their obsessions, the grandeur of their order, and the sheer audacity of their control linger with you in dreams, guiding your curiosity, sparking your wonder, and reminding you that history, in all its strangeness, is never truly dead, but alive in the echoes of law, life, and human imagination. And so, traveler, rest now, and good night.